Welcome to the Aerospace Ambition podcast. I'm Marius, an engineer with a deep passion for sustainable aviation and AI. In today's discussion, we'll take a very high-level view on how the industry tackles the goal of sustainable aviation. Joining us today is Haldane Dodd. Haldane is the Executive Director at the Air Transport Action Group, also known as ATAG. Previously, he was Head of Communications and Advocacy at ATAG and Communications Manager with Airports Council International. Haldane started his aviation career at the listed company Auckland International Airport Limited, which runs New Zealand's busiest airport. He has a background in broadcast media and holds a Bachelor of Communications Studies. Haldane, welcome on the show.
Marius, thank you very much for having me on.
It's a great pleasure to have you, Haldane. And I'd like to start off with a very typical question, but it's something to set the scene, and that is the role of ATAG. And maybe we can look at it through the glasses of our previous guest, who was Dan Rutherford, who also works for an NGO. So maybe you can explain what the ATAG is and also contrast it to other NGOs that are out there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's interesting, the name of your podcast as well, Aviation Ambition, because I think that's certainly what we try and bring to the conversation as well, some ambition in how the air transport industry is going to face some of the big challenges that we've got coming up. And of course, at the moment, and certainly for the last 15, 16 years, that's really been around the climate change challenge. So that's what our real focus is. So Air Transport Action Group was started in 1990, and initially focused on issues of capacity development in Europe. And then, as I said, for the last 15 or so years has really been focused on climate change and how, as a whole industry, we can tackle this problem together. So we do take a very high-level view. We don't sort of get into the technical weeds of these things like most of your audience probably has to deal with on a day-to-day basis. But we try and have alignment across the whole sector, bringing in airlines, airports, air traffic management companies, and then the manufacturers of aircraft and engines across the entire supply chain to say, how can we work together collaboratively to tackle the climate change challenge? How can we work with governments to make sure that they're on board with this challenge as well? And what do we need at a very high policy type level? And then obviously it's supported by a huge amount of work that thousands of engineers and designers and sort of future thinkers within the industry are helping to progress on the technical side and new types of fuel and so forth. So, we really do try and take that high level overview. And one of the most important things that we've been able to do over the last 15 or 16 years is really bring the industry together around a series of goals. So how can we meet some of these goals to contribute as we can as an industry to the wider economy-wide goals that there are under things like the Paris Agreement and so forth.
Right. And how would you contrast your NGO to other NGOs that are out there? Are there ways to differentiate? And do you take within that spectrum of NGOs different roles?
Well, it's interesting that you're calling us an NGO, actually, because we represent the industry. So our members, our board of directors, our strategic associates are all industry players. And so we're not sort of fulfilling the same function that a normal NGO would in that sense. But in many ways, we are an NGO. We're a non-governmental organization. We're not an individual corporate either. We are a collection of different corporates that are all focused on these long-term goals. And so I think the important thing that we're able to bring is that industry focus. And it contrasts a lot with a lot of other sectors, I would say, that we have got a pretty robust plan in place to get to where we need to in 2050. We unusually, as an industry, will reach out to governments at the UN and individual governments asking for certain types of policy to be put in place. Most industries will sort of shy away from any kind of regulation at all, but we're pretty used to it in aviation. But we need to make sure it's the right type of regulation, so that it's not just regulating for the sake of it because it sounds good, but it actually fulfills a purpose. And that's really where we come in, is to try and make sure that governments are ready to support that process.
Well, funny you pointed out or you questioned the fact that I said or stressed NGO because I had a question prepared. Just like why are you an NGO if you have members that span across the industry, which is a for-profit industry?
Yeah.
But you've given the perfect explanation for that. What I'm wondering is, how do you work together with research institutions, which are not for-profit? I've also seen the aviation facts, for example. How do you make sure that these facts are always to the newest state of research in fast-moving areas, for example, like contrail management, which we'll touch upon a little bit later, but in those areas where there may be more progress than in others, how do you work with research institutions in order to stay up to date?
Well, as I said, we tend to take a higher level overview rather than getting into the details of the research. Obviously, it's incredibly important, and we support all research that can take place in this area. But our goal is to really try and make sure that the developments that are taking place are able to be reflected in a policy sense. So sometimes things are moving very quickly at a detailed research level, but we need to make sure that that is understandable to policymakers, and that as we know, research can shift, and the science of a topic can shift over time. It's important to make sure that we are not responding to every single little shift, but we're able to take a higher level overview to make sure that we are putting in place the right types of responses to this research and responses to the scientific change as well. So it's always quite interesting when you're in the middle of what's happening in a commercial sense, what's happening in a technical sense, what's happening scientifically, and what's happening politically as well, and trying to marry all those different audiences and the different timelines that each of them has, the different responsibilities that each of them has as well. And then if you look at it from a political level, as we do, and trying to deal with things through ICAO, you've got 193 different countries with maybe not quite 193 different opinions, but certainly a range of different opinions and different priorities in their own national interests to try and balance out. And so it's always quite interesting to figure out how to fit within those different realms. And that's where an organization like ours comes in, to try and make sure that we are responding in the most appropriate way.
I've already mentioned the topic of contrail management. I want to dive straight into that topic and understand what is the take of ATAG on that topic. And you just used a very interesting word. You said it also has to be understandable, like all of the scientific progress has to be understandable to the entire ecosystem. So I'm really curious to learn your viewpoint, as there are different kinds of stakeholders within your organization. Has everyone understood the topic of warming contrails?
Yeah, so we're in a really interesting place on the non-CO2 front, and particularly on the contrails area at the moment. I think for the last 15, 16 years, we've really been focused as an industry on CO2. And in many ways, that was a really important thing to focus on first, because it is an area that requires some pretty big changes in the way that we do things, whether that is particularly around SAF and having a completely new energy system supply. If we're going to move over to sustainable aviation fuel, that's got very big numbers attached to it. It's got huge numbers in terms of plant development, in terms of financing, and I spend a lot of time talking to banks at the moment and institutional investors to try and get them ready for where we need to be with sustainable aviation fuel. Luckily, we've got a solution in SAF that doesn't require a wholesale change in aircraft and fueling systems at airports, because that would have been a whole different matter. But as soon as we start getting into something like hydrogen, then you will need to think about changing aircraft and will need to change fuel systems at airports. So that will bring its own challenges as well. But of course, politically, there's also a big challenge with carbon, because hydrocarbons are very profitable for certain parts of the world and certain massive companies in the world as well, who don't really want to make a lot of progress in this area. And so trying to figure out how we deal with the carbon challenge was really a big issue. We've managed to do that. Now, we've by no means got where we need to get to in terms of solving the carbon challenge. Of course, we've got the next 25 years to try and figure out how we get to net zero in a fast, but in an appropriate way. But we kind of got our plan in place. We know where we need to go in that sense. Now we are really focusing as an industry, I think, across a range of different parts of the industry on contrails in particular. And this is a really interesting one. We're a really interesting space in that area at the moment. I think there's recognition that there's a range of different solutions available right now. So the answer to what to do if we're going to avoid contrails is, and I use this term very advisedly, relatively simple. Of course, there's a lot of complexity to that, but actually what we need to do to avoid contrail formation is a relatively well understood idea. And obviously we need to do more and more trials to figure out how that works in practice, and how we fit that into airspace is a really important one as well. On the science side, I think there's also generally a pretty good understanding from across the industry that scientific consensus right now is that on balance contrails are warming, and so we do need to do something about that. So the industry's in a reasonable place there as well. Although I would just say as a parenthesized statement, I'm surprised a little bit when we were getting some briefings from the scientific community over the last year and a half on this, that the uncertainty bars are still fairly wide and relatively similar to what they were sort of 20 or 30 years ago. So I would have thought that might have been reduced, but we're fully on board with the idea that we need to try and avoid contrails, and particularly persistent warming contrails. Where we have uncertainty, I think, at the moment, and it's a really important piece of uncertainty, is where ISSRs are formed, and exactly where we need to avoid. And so there's a lot of work going on to try and understand that better, to try and get the monitoring better for exactly which parts of the airspace we need to avoid. Because, of course, the better understanding we get of that, the more appropriate the solutions can be. Because if we're trying to shift flights around pretty large areas of airspace because there might be ISSRs within there, then we're going to end up with congestion problems. We're going to exacerbate CO2 emissions and so forth. So that is kind of a key part of the question at the moment. And there's a lot of work going on. And IATA's got a lot of work going on at the moment, trying to figure out what type of sensors would be required on board aircraft, if that's the appropriate solution. And also, I know that there's work going on in terms of satellite observations and so forth. But getting that right is going to be really important before we put in place the actual solutions that need to come in. So we're in this really interesting space. There's a lot of work going on. There's a lot of trials that needs to continue as much as possible, and more research, obviously, in that area as well.
On the website, on the ATAG website, there is this very useful tab called Aviation Facts. It's like a cheat sheet for everyone who likes to drop some numbers. It's very useful. And I realized that non-CO2 effects are not listed there yet. What would it take? Which kind of certainty would be required for you to also incorporate that in this whole list of metrics?
Oh, well, I mean, at the moment, our focus, as I've just said, has been really on the CO2 side, and that's where our focus for the Waypoint 2050 research has been. So that's where most of those figures come from. I think as we move forward in this area, and as I said, there's a huge amount of work going on this year, in particular, in this area, we'll be able to start rounding out some of those areas of discussion as well.
Yeah, because there is this difference in certainty between individual flights and whole fleet, or the overall impact of contrails.
Yeah.
And the point that you just made, I find very fair. And that is, well, we should only take action if we have the certainty that, this one flight as a net effect would be a positive outcome, let's say. However, since you also mentioned that there is the scientific consensus right now that overall there is a warming effect, I'm wondering, including it on the Aviation Facts website would certainly raise some kind of awareness. How do you balance this trade-off?
Yeah, no, that's an important one. I think the key question there is who needs to be aware of these issues at the moment, and certainly within the industry, within the scientific community, there's enough awareness because we're working on it. We need to get to a slightly better understanding of where we need to go before we reach out to the political audience. Because what we don't want to see, which unfortunately we're already seeing in Europe, is responses to this trying to figure out how to deal with this, but in the wrong way. And there's always a bit of a danger with that, with political audiences. I would also say, going one step beyond that, reaching out to the public. I think the public, the broad public, which is a horrible audience to talk about, but in terms of trying to identify what that means. But if you're looking at the flying public, they kind of understand the CO2 problem, even though it's much more easy to understand, and there's certainly a level of certainty there. But trying to get them to understand, some of the real challenges around contrail questions is a really interesting one. And I think you're right in saying that there's quite a difference between the fleet and the overall impact at a global level of warming, and trying to pin that down to individual flights or groups of flights. And that's one of the key challenges that we also need to overcome. So there are a whole series of questions that need to be solved before we can start moving into the policy space. And one of those is, what is the trade-off? What is the non-CO2 or the contrail trade-off versus the CO2 trade-off? And how do you balance that out? And of course, there are a range of different metrics that you can use in terms of global warming potential or global temperature potential, which can come up with some very different results. And so the question then becomes, do you move this one flight and create 2% extra CO2 from shifting it to avoid the ISSR? Is that balanced out by the avoidance of the contrail and the warming that might have? And I think one of the challenges that we found with some of the trials so far is that the key question is, did you actually avoid a contrail that wouldn't have been there or that would have been there to begin with? So if you'd flown the original flight trajectory, would that have actually created a contrail? And some of the trials that we've seen so far have kind of been a bit of a 50-50 yes or no on that, which is not really certain enough to be able to shift those flights to create the extra CO2. So that's one of the key areas that we need to figure out a little bit more as well. But I'm fairly confident that we've got the right people working in various different institutions around the world on this subject to be able to answer some of those questions. And then when we've got the answers to those questions, the solutions themselves are relatively straightforward. One of the key things there, and it goes again to this individual flight versus system-wide question, is it's all very well changing one flight or changing one airline's flights if one airline wants to do contrail avoidance. But over an area like Central Europe, if you've got every single airline and every single flight trying to avoid the same piece of airspace, what kind of flow-on effect does that have? Because that's where it becomes really challenging. And that's where it has systematic impacts and potentially bigger CO2 impacts than just looking at the one flight by itself. So yeah, I think we're, as I said before, we're in this really interesting space. We're in a pretty good place at the moment, but I think it's really important for us not to have too fast a response to this because of some work that's been done which shows avoiding or shifting 5% of flights maybe increases CO2 emissions by 2%, but will reduce the overall climate impact by a great degree. It sounds fantastic. We need to unpick some of the underlying discussion on that and the operational challenges that come with that before we actually push the button and make things shift. But I don't think we're hugely far off on that, but we'll see.
We saw that the EU was actually the European Commission launched this call, and for the first time they explicitly mentioned contrails are a problem and we are calling for solutions for that. How do you see this approach? Are we at a point in time where we can call for solutions already?
I think we should be investigating all the potential solutions that could be. I don't think it's useful for us to put them into practice just yet because of those big questions that I've mentioned before. The most important, which is humidity and understanding where the ISSRs are. Because if we try and avoid areas we think are ISSRs at the moment, we could be ending up creating potentially more contrails, or not actually shifting away from where contrails would have been to begin with. So we do need a better understanding there first. I think the The European Commission's call for MRV on non-CO2 is probably premature because I'm not entirely sure what they're going to do with the data that they're going to be collecting, and I'm not sure that they quite understand that either. So it will be interesting to see how that develops.
Previous guests on this podcast have called this approach kind of like a startup approach. And pointed out the benefits of this kind of approach where you try to move fast, especially with, I mean, there is this opportunity to reduce climate impact in a shorter time frame that, the big kind of solutions or contributors, then, it will basically offer the opportunity to make an impact quicker than with other solutions that are proposed out there. So do you think that this startup mentality of saying we try out things and we move fast, even though we don't know exactly at this point how it would turn out, is this a good way to go about solving such a kind of a problem, especially in an industry that usually has very long processes?
Well, that is interesting because startups and venture capitalists tend to see things on a 10-to-1 basis. So they will support 10 projects and they hope that one might survive as an idea. But they throw huge amounts of money at this. And I'm not sure that if you're looking at a global system like ours, we have the ability to do that in a real way that's going to have the real impact that we need. So on the carbon side of things, if we're looking at the solutions there, which we know to be, new technology, improvements in operations, shifting away from fossil fuel towards sustainable aviation fuel, we know what the pathway is there. And there are some parts of that, particularly on the technology side, where startups can be a really interesting part of the solution, particularly around hydrogen, electric, hybrid electric, and so forth. But when you're looking at a systematic change, you need to take everybody along with you. And we don't have a huge amount of time in this. We've got 25 years or so to make the difference there. On the other side, on contrails in particular, I think we need to be careful that we don't bring in unintended consequences in this area. And as I said, I don't think we're all that far off. Getting a much better understanding of what we need to do or where we need to avoid. And the solutions themselves are being investigated in a pretty heavy way at the moment. So I don't think we're in a bad place there. The big challenge, and it's a challenge that the European Commission's MRV requirements doesn't solve either, is understanding where the humidity is and understanding where the ISSRs are. That is the big thing that we need to solve. I'm fairly sure that is solvable from a scientific perspective. We just need to figure out exactly how to do that. And once we've done that, we can put in place the solutions.
Peter de Bock, a previous guest of ours, has introduced us to this approach of the ARPA-E,
Right.
and basically trying out these moonshot projects, which essentially say we have one problem and we have an approach that has, like, for example, 3 dimensions, one being a humidity sensor, AI, and then algorithms that are working on the edge. Let's say that is, the solution package, but we have 5 teams of different stakeholders and they are sort of like competing. It's sort of like a hackathon. But that goes against the point that you made where you said maybe a startup approach is not the right approach. So how is this approach that the ARPA-E takes different from a startup approach then?
Yeah, no. So I think there's a difference between doing things on a research basis and trials. We need to have as many different options there as possible. But when I was talking about not taking the startup approach, I was talking about when you're operationalizing something, when you're actually bringing it into operational use. And I think there's a fundamental sort of divergence here a little bit between the research community, the academic community, and what we have to do in the operation. And that's because you're looking at modeling, you're looking at the theory of the system in a lab setting. Switching that over to real world operations has real world consequences. And we need to make sure that the switch between those two different areas of activity is able to be done with confidence before we get into actually changing flight routes, which will actually change, contrail formation or not, and will change CO2 emissions or not. And so there is that fundamental difference in the way that the different stakeholders approach it. Now, obviously, they need to work together as much as possible. The research community needs to understand the operational challenges as much as possible. The operational community and the airlines and the management and everything that we do on a political front need to understand the science as much as possible. So all this dialogue that's taking place, the working groups and so forth, are a really important part of that process.
Now we've dived in very deeply into the topic of contrail management, which of course I had to do in continuity of this whole platform. But let's get back to a higher level or a higher flight level. Now I'm throwing in a very dramatic term, which our first guest, Finlay Asher from Safe Landing used, and that is a climate crash. There may be tipping points, in the world with an increase of global temperature. How do you look at this risk? Are you afraid of something like that happening? Is there any way to prepare for something like that? How do you look at that?
Well, absolutely. I mean, that's why I'm so passionate about what we're doing, because there is an enormous risk. I was speaking at a conference here in London the day before yesterday to a group of finance people. And I've always found it quite interesting talking to banks and other financiers where they kind of use this ESG term as a bit of a badge, like on the sidelines of what they do, that they do all their banking stuff and then they have to do ESG as well because everybody tells them they have to. And I said to them, listen, we can't think in that way anymore. We have to think of sustainability as core corporate strategy for all of us. And there's a couple of reasons why that's really important. First of all, it's the right thing to do. But secondly, actually, from a pure business perspective, when we think about the impact that climate change is going to have on our operations as an industry if we don't do something about this, and the world doesn't do something about climate change, the increased storminess will have increasing impacts on the way that we operate. The changes in destinations will be pretty severe as well. There might be sometimes if we don't really try and avoid this, there might be some parts of the year where you can't go to the Mediterranean, for example, because it's too hot. And so whole destinations will shift. We're already having impacts from climate change in terms of runway capacity when it comes to being too hot a day. Aircraft performance is really affected. Increased snowfall, increased rainfall, flooding, wildfires. They're always starting to have an impact already. And the last couple of years has really shown that in a very dramatic way across the world, not just in the developed world and the developing world as well. There have been real impacts of climate change already. So these things are starting to be felt. And that becomes a business issue because it's not just then a question that European consumers are thinking about, but consumers all over the world. And of course, there are people that want to fly in the future as well. So we are going to have to think about it from that sense. But also, actually, in a pure business way, insurance is going to be a really interesting part of this discussion as well. So already there are parts of the world where insurance companies will not insure property because of flood risk. That's going to increase as a problem. So this becomes a real business case issue. So I'm, yes, concerned about that. It's one of the reasons why I do what I do. And I think we should all be concerned about that, but I don't think we should be despondent about it. I don't think we should be unafraid of attacking this problem because it is a real challenge, it's a real problem, but it is solvable. And I think what we've shown with Waypoint 2050 is that we know that we can get to net zero in 2050 in aviation. It's part of our contribution to the overall climate impacts across the entire economy. Is it going to be easy? Absolutely not. There's going to be the challenge of our lifetimes and the challenge of our century. But I think of any industry in the world, we are capable of actually solving our part of the problem ourselves. We do the impossible every day. 12 million passengers get to their destination every single day across the world. We break the laws of gravity every day as our sector. The things that we can do with engines are just outstanding, amazing technology. We can solve big issues in aviation. We've done it before with safety and so forth. And one of the ways that we do that is by working together. So that's one of the reasons why our organization is really vital in that sense, bringing together all the different parts of the industry to have a common voice and a common objective of the future, and also working through ICAO. And we're used to dealing with these big global challenges through an organization like ICAO. We have 12,000 standards and recommended practices that mean a pilot can take off in Frankfurt and land in Beijing and speak the same language and see the same signs and use the same radio spectrum across the entire voyage and the same technology everywhere. We're used to having that global standard in place and working together on these big global challenges. So that's why I'm confident that we can do it, but that doesn't mean it's easy.
Absolutely. Wow. I've just been smiling for the last couple of minutes. The way you described what aviation actually already managed to do in the past and the miracle it performs every single day. I totally agree. Now, looking at these scenarios or predictions that you mentioned with regards to the goals that we set for the industry, we had Roger Teo on a couple of episodes ago who said we are currently not on track to meet the net zero goal for aviation in 2050. Then Rutherford, the previous guest, said that in the ICCT kind of methodology or terminology. They have different kinds of scenarios, and currently we are on the action scenario, in contrast to the breakthrough scenario. And the breakthrough scenario is the one that we actually need in order to meet those goals. What makes you confident that, and now I'm using the term, breakthrough, that we are reaching breakthroughs in every single dimension, or that we are reaching the net zero target?
Well, listen, I don't think there's any doubt that we need to do more and faster. And that's certainly the case. We're in a good position now in the fact that we've managed to get the industry on board with net zero 2050 and a pathway to get there. And there are a whole range of different roadmaps to how aviation can get to net zero in 2050. We've got one, ICCT has one that Dan put together. But each of them actually says very similar things. They all show the same potential solutions and in relatively similar proportions as well. So what it shows is that actually there is this big general pathway that we need to take to get there. What I've been saying is we have every potential to get to where we need to in 2050, but we only have a certain amount of time to start making that happen. And already we've started for sure, but we really need to accelerate the process, particularly around sustainable aviation fuel deployment in the next 5 to 10 years. If we're not in the right level of scale up, the right trajectory in terms of the curve of upward development or deployment of SAF in the next, within the next 10 years, we're not going to reach where we need to in 2050. And we will have to rely on other things like carbon removals much more than we would hope to. But I think given the level of conversation that's taking place at the moment, given the agreement that was reached last year at CAF 3 under the ICAO auspices for a goal where you've got every country in the world basically agreeing that we're going to have to get to around 5% emissions reduction through the use of SAF in 2030. Having those political level discussions and getting those agreements is a really important part of that process. And then all the discussions that we're having at the moment with the finance community, they're starting to get really interested in the space in a big way. So we're going to start seeing some really important shifts. So over the last few years, we've seen production and use of SAF go from 200,000 tons to 500,000 tons last year to probably 1.5 million tons this year. That is exponential. If we can keep that going, I think that we're probably within a good shot of actually getting to where we need to.
This nicely leads on to Dan's question in our tradition, which he passed on to you. Mm-hmm. And basically his question is following up on a comment of yours at the COP28 event. Okay. And your comment, in essence, was that airlines were very willing customers to purchase SAFs, but the incumbent fuel producers, that is oil producers, are not doing enough to produce SAFs for airlines to buy them. So concretely, his question is, what policies do you think will be needed to motivate the oil producers to produce more SAFs so that the airlines can purchase them and meet their net zero goals?
Yes. So I absolutely believe that traditional energy industry is not anywhere where it needs to be in order to get us to net zero. And this is not just within an aviation context, it's across the entire economy. They have been very backward in thinking. I have been disappointed to see that at a time of record profits over the last couple of years, the big oil majors have started to actually pull back on their climate commitments. Again, not just in aviation, but across their portfolio of activities. And so they do need to be doing an awful lot more. And I think there would be a time that comes where governments will need to step in. I don't know exactly what the policy approach would be there, but if they're not showing willingness to actually be part of the solution in a sense, then I think governments will need to intervene in some way. But I also think there's a way around some of the traditional fuel manufacturers. And we're starting to see from the new energy companies, some of the big names in SAF, like Sky Energy, like Gevo, like LanzaJet and World Energy, that they're really starting to be able to finance their work by going directly to other sources of finance, like the big banks and so forth, all of which have climate commitments that are aligned with net zero in 2050. So you might start seeing a bit of a divergence in model there, but that doesn't mean that the traditional energy sector gets off the hook. They really need to pull out everything that they can in the space as well, beyond what they've been doing already.
This was a very extensive answer to his question. Of course, you also have the chance to pass on a question to our next guest. And the next guest is Sean Andrews from NATS.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of my big things is ensuring that we don't always only focus on Europe and North America and the developed world. I think we need to really make sure as an industry and as governments as well that we are able to help progress things in the developing world as well. One of the benefits of that sometimes is that you can leapfrog technologies. And so my question is, from an ANSP perspective, how can we make sure that we take full advantage of satellite-based navigation that's coming in today, particularly in the developing world, and what needs to be done to help promote more use of satellite-based ADSB and really try and push them to be as efficient as possible, or use the airspace as efficiently as possible, including for things like contrails eventually, but particularly around flight tracks at the moment.
I love it. I'll take it on.
Okay.
Other than that, Haldane, thanks very much for participating.
No problem. Thank you very much for having me on. I think it's always quite interesting, particularly I know your audience is a very technical audience and knows a lot of the great details, but sometimes we also need to take things at a higher level and figure out how we can explain some of those technical things to a political audience and get things moving on a policy perspective as well. So that's hopefully where we provide a bit of a bridge. But thank you very much for having me on.
We certainly did. Well, thanks to you again and speak soon.
Thank you.